Hello, welcome. And so today's tutorial, we're going to be going over how to make a multi-type inventory system, which has support for both entities, weapons, and player models. And so you can go ahead and create something interesting for your server and customize it to your liking. All right, so for the setup here, we basically have the same thing. We're just working inside the tutorial add-on. However, inside our Lua folder, we now have our entities folder. So you want to make sure that you have entities inside your Lua, and then inside there we have our inv_item. If we open this up, you can see we have the three files here, which actually correspond on the left side. So in our share.lua, we just have some information. You want to make sure that this is the same. You can change the author, print name, etc., whatever you want. And then on our server side, we just have an initialize function which sets the model and basically just prepares this model to be created. And then in our client side, we don't really have anything except a draw function here, which is drawing the model. And then that's it for our entity. Next, inside our actual Lua client and server and shared, we just have basically empty files here. And so we'll get set up on those. So for our inventory, what we want to do is essentially create a way to store items, and we're going to need an ID for each item, or maybe a class name. And then we have this entity here, which is our inventory item, which is going to replicate or sort of mimic the items that we create. So if we want to support for player models, entities, and weapons, we would use this base item and kind of decorate it to look like the item that they're going to be picking up. So what we're going to do first is actually just go ahead and set up some form of initialized features for the inventory. So we have something that can store items on the player. I'm going to go ahead and create a global table here. I'm going to call this, for example, tutorial_inv, and we'll just set it like that. And then I'm also going to do store a value on here called debugging. So I'm going to have a bunch of prints in here. And if this is set to true, then it will print out our debugging stuff. So I'm going to save that, go into our server side file now. And then what I need to do is actually store some functions on the player. So I'm just going to look up the meta table here for the player. And if you guys don't understand any of this, I have covered pretty much everything that I'm doing here in other previous tutorials. So I recommend checking those out if you are confused at any moment. So we're going to go ahead and just do function _p, and we're going to say inventory log, and then we'll have a message. And then we'll just do if not tot_im.debugging, meaning we're not debugging. Then we're just going to return end. So the code below will not get executed. Then self, which is the player that we're currently working with, we're going to go ahead and run a chat print message on them, and we're just going to say the message. And so now we can call inventory log throughout our code, and it will only chat print if our debugging is enabled. Next thing we want to do is actually create a method to initialize the player's inventory. So to do that, I'm going to say function _p inv init. And what this is going to do is we're going to create a table that is on the player that we're initializing. So we'll just call this TUT for tutorial inventory equals table. And so we're just going to have this table here. And then we're also going to use that function that we just set up, which is our inventory logging. We're going to say self inv log, and then we're going to log inventory successfully initialized. And then with that, I'm going to go ahead and initialize this inventory whenever the player first joins in. So to do that, we're going to hook onto player initial spawn. We're going to go ahead and run the initialize. And so basically this is going to call this is going to wipe their table, or basically just prepare it for data. So whenever we are loading data, we'll go ahead and initialize it, and then we'll load it, and then we'll shove all their items into this table at a later time. I'm actually already spawned in, and so this won't get called if I respawn. So what I'm going to do is just going to make a command real quick that will allow me to basically force initialize my inventory. So I'm going to do command.add, and we'll call this reload inv. We'll say if not POY is admin. So if they're not an admin, then they can't do this. Actually, it should be super admin for the most part. So if they're not a super admin, then we're going to return in. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and initialize the inventory. So now if I go in game here and I type reload inv, you now see in chat inventory successfully initialized. So there we go. That's all set up. Now we have this table on my player here, which I can reference. So the next portion is we're going to need to go ahead and set up some form of items to store in this inventory. We're not going to have slots. It's just going to be a simple list. You can use and drop items and pick them up. That's what we're going for here. So let's go ahead and get that set up here. I'm going to make a function actually to create items. So it's just a bit more easier, kind of like if you ever worked with DarkRP, there's a function to create shipments, jobs. It'll be basically the same thing. So we're going to have a reference to all the items that we create here. So I'm going to say items equals table. And I think that's all we will really need. I'm not really sure. We can do everything based on class name, I'm pretty sure. So now that we have this table here, we're going to have to make a way to populate it with items. So I'm just going to say function tut-inv add item. And then we'll have, like, let's say, for example, a class name. Actually, we don't even need that. We could just say data. And then what we'll do here is we'll say local class name equals tut_inv dot, or sorry, no. We're going to say class name equals data dot class name, and then we'll do tut_inv dot items class name equals data. Okay, and so basically this is really simple here. Nothing really crazy is happening. We could go ahead and put some form of logging here maybe, but that's not really necessary. And so now what we can do is we can set up a bunch of different data for our items here. And this can get a little crazy because this is what kind of defines your inventory system and how big it's going to get and how complicated you're going to make it. So you want to make sure that you kind of have a good structure here. This is really important. So I'm going to think about this a bit as I go along. I might remove things, add things, but we'll see. So now what we can do is actually call this function here. We're going to say tut_inv add item, and then we can go ahead and paste a table into here, and we can put information in here. So I'm going to say class name equals, and then let me go ahead and game and get, like, for example, let's just start off with weapons. I feel like those are kind of simple. We'll do the SKS. Okay. So we have the SKS there, and then we'd want like a model. What I'm going to do is make a thing that'll make it really easy for us to return the world models of weapons. So I'm actually going to make that command here now. So I'm just going to say con command dot add. And actually we don't really, this can actually happen on the client, I'm pretty sure. So let's do it on there. We're going to say con command dot add, and we're going to say, I don't know, inv_model. And this will just get the weapons world models path. And then what we need to do is we're going to say local wep equals POI get active weapon. And I actually don't know if we need POI since this is on the client, so it might not work. We'll see. And we'll say if not is valid wep, then return in. So if they don't have a valid weapon, we're just going to not continue. But if they do, we're going to say print weapon get weapon world model. Okay. And now I'm going to go in game and I'm going to give myself the SKS here. Okay. So now if I do inv_model, you can now see we have the world model here. The problem with FAS though, it seems that it's not using the correct world model. So that's not a really great example. So actually let me use a different model that isn't FAS, for example, like M9K. So we'll start off with the FG42, maybe that will be better. Okay, yeah, you can see it's actually giving us the right model here. So I'm just gonna say model equals this, and I'm just not gonna touch FAS for the most part. If you really wanna get the models for FAS, you're gonna have to look into the code. But for this tutorial, I'm just gonna stick with M9K. So we got a model there, class name, create a type here. We'll say type equals weapon. And so now that this is a weapon, we can do specific things on use, or we can override an on use method. But for now, I'm just going to stick with the type weapon. And so if it's a weapon, we know whenever we give this item or they select it, we would want to give it. Otherwise, if it's an entity and they select it, then we'll spawn it in front of them. If it's ammo, we'll spawn it in front of them. If it's like a model, we'll set their player model, if that makes sense. Okay, so we got that in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in another one, such as, let's do a shotgun now, the double barrel. So the next step here is, now that we have these items set up, is to give an item to the player and actually get that stored in the inventory and perhaps display that information on the screen. So that's what I'm going to do now. Additionally, we could also add in a print name, a nice name for these items, because right now it's just showing the class name and the bottle. But yeah, let's just get into adding items and we can add that portion later. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and make a function here called give item, or we'll say inv give, and we'll pass in a class name. And what we need to do now is make sure that this item that they're attempting to give is actually valid. So I'm going to go here now, and we can actually loop over this table and get the valid items. And actually, if I print this real quick, just to demonstrate that for you, print table, you can now see that we have our class name here along with all the data that's associated with it. And so to check if this item is a valid item, we can go ahead and whenever we give an item, we can say if, we'll say if not, meaning it's not in there, the class name, Then we'll just say self invlog attempted to receive an invalid item, and then we can concatenate the class name. Okay, and then we'll just go ahead and return end. So basically, if we give the wrong class name for whatever reason, our code will not run below, and it'll just say that this person attempted to receive an invalid item. Next thing we want to do is actually store this item in there. So to do that, we can actually just say, we could use table.insert. That's one way. We can say tut_inv, and we're going to store the class name. Okay. And then what I'm going to do now is just make a command to give myself items. So I'm going to do con command .add inv give, and we'll do function, and I think it's POI, and then it could be args maybe. And then we're going to say local class name equals args1, so basically the space that's followed by the command. And then we're going to say POI inv give, and then we're going to give them the class name. And we should also check to see if they're super admin. Okay, so now that we have to check to if they're super admin, we can continue and test out this command here. So these are the class names that I have. And actually, real quick, I'm just going to add in a debug print here, self invlog successfully picked up item, and we'll do the class name just so we know that it's working. Okay, so I'm going to take this here. I'm going to do inv give, and then we'll just do that. Attempting to give an invalid item I. Okay, so something's wrong with my con command here. I think my arguments might be messed up. Let me go look that up real quick. Okay, so it appears that this is actually supposed to be CMD, and then this is supposed to be arg. So now I'm just going to go ahead and run that command again, and you can see successfully picked up M9K D barrel. So if I go ahead and just mess up this class name for whatever reason, see attempted to give invalid item, and so we know that that's not working, but we know that that item is registered, so it's now in our inventory. And so that works. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind, though, is that this is being stored into the player's inventory on the server. However, the client needs to realize what's in their inventory. Otherwise, in their menu, they can't draw out all their information and manipulate it in the way that they would like to. So right now, all this information is just stored on the server. So to fix this, what we need to do is add in networking. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm just going to create a table here just called nets. And basically, this is just going to be what we util.add network string. And I'm going to say inv_give. Okay. And then we're going to loop over this table here. I pairs nets. And then we're going to just say do, and we're going to util.add network string the value. So this is the value. We're going to util.add network string that. And then so now we can now call inv_give. So what we can do here now is say net.start inv_give, and we can write a string here, which is going to be the class name of the item that they just received. And then we're going to send that to the player that received the item. We could broadcast this if we want other players to be aware of other players' items, but that's not really necessary in this case. So to keep them safe, I'm just going to send it to the player themselves, and we're going to network the class name. One bad instance of networking would be to write the entire table of items. That would be the simplest way in terms of like writing code physically, but for optimization purposes, you only want to network the change. That way you can just rebuild the table on the client instead of just sending this whole chunk of data when you don't really need to, because all that other information did not change. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now what I'm going to do is on the client here, we're going to go ahead and receive this information and do something with it. Also, one more thing that I just realized, we're going to also need to make the client aware of initialization. So we're going to have to network that as well. So let's just say local class name equals net.readString. There's no need to really validate this information for the most part, because the server already checked to see if the item is valid. So we can just do table.insert local player.tut_inv and that class name. Okay, so now that we got that, I'm going to go ahead and actually fix the initialization here. So we'll say init. And then whenever we call inventory init, we're going to say net.start. And we'll do init. That way we can send the client to let them know that their inventory has now initialized. So we're just going to call that, and then we're going to send it. Nothing needs to be passed. So here we'll do net.receive. function end, and then we'll say local player dot tut underscore inv equals table. And then I'm just going to go ahead and reload my inventory again, or call reload inv, so I can initialize it again, and now the client is aware. Okay, so now that we got that, I'm just going to go ahead and print my table client side, so I know that the client is aware of the inventory. So I'm going to call give, and I'm going to give myself double barrels. And you can now see that it's getting pretty big. I have 8 double barrels in there, so that's working fine and dandy. Awesome, wonderful. Okay. So there's a couple things that we could do to actually spice up this inventory, just something to keep in mind for future reference. You can see that we have 8 entries here, but we could actually store additional data on these items, such as like an amount, so you can keep track of how many you have without having to loop over each time. That would be something to keep in mind. However, for this case, we're just going for something simple that has support for weapons, models, entities, and such. But there's a lot that you can do in terms of your structure. So this is a very simple structure, just to keep that in mind. So we know that the inventory is being built correctly. Now, the next thing that we want to do is let's actually go ahead and get some form of setup going here on our menu. So I'm going to go ahead and create, let's do a chat command. Let me look that up real quick. Okay, so for our chat command here, we're going to use on player chat, which is client side, and this is going to be used to open up our menu. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this just to be a little bit faster here, and we can go ahead and delete all of this information. Actually, I do need that check there, and we'll call this inv open. Okay, so basically we just want to check to see if the player is equal to the local player, and if it isn't, then we're just going to return n, meaning this code here will not execute. And so what I'm going to do is going to call tut_inv.open, and this is going to be a function that we will create in just a second, which will open the inventory. It's going to say function tut_inv.open, and let's say if not, meaning look at the player here. We'll say if they don't have an inventory for whatever reason, we won't open this. So if not py.tutinv, then return n, meaning it's nil. Then what we're going to do is get this menu here set up. So I'm just going to speed run something simple just so we can have a visualization of our items. But you can make this look however you want. I strongly recommend spicing it up and making it look good. And let's just try that. Also, we need to also check the text that they're typing to make sure that it is inventory. So we're gonna say if string text, and we'll lower this string.lower, or is it lowercase? String.lower, the string text is not equal to inv, then we're gonna return n. And the reason why we string.lower this is because if they did like a capital I, a capital N, or whatever, it'll still count as exclamation point INV. So now if we go ahead and save this and I do exclamation point INV, you can now see this is our inventory. It's a little too wide for me because I'm just going for like a little list here. So let me try that, or like that. Okay, awesome. So now what we need to do is just spice this up a little bit. I'm going to override the paint function, just make it simple. Nothing complicated here. Okay, so now that that's good, and I go ahead and open this again, you can see this is what it looks like. Simple, pretty. Okay, now we need a scroll, and basically what this scroll is going to do is it's going to, we're going to populate all of our items on this scroll menu here. So we're going to say local scroll equals inv add. We're going to add a descroll panel, and we're just going to use docking to essentially fill this up and make it take up the whole screen. Next part we're going to do is we're going to loop over our items. And so this is similar to like a scoreboard. We have to loop over every single player to create a little entry for them, and you can see the player on the list. We're going to do the same thing here, but except for our items. So we're going to say 4kb in pairs. So we're going to use 4kb in pairs, and we're going to loop over our player inventory. So I'm going to say local py_inv equals py.tut_inv. So I'm basically going to be referencing this just by this variable here, just for simplicity. And then we're going to go ahead and add some panels here. So I'm going to say local item panel equals, and then we'll do a scroll. We're going to add, and we're going to add a D panel, and we'll say item panel doc. We're going to doc top, and then also let's do scroll dot panels equals table. So we're going to store these panels here in this table, and then we're going to say scroll dot panels, and we'll say item panel equals true. And the reason for this is so we can resize the panels correctly to the size that we want when we're using docking, because we can we can control how tall they are, but we need to reference that whenever the size changes for the scroll panel. So I'm just going to go save that now, and then let's try opening that up and see how that looks. Okay, you can see we have a bunch of items here. Let's go ahead and add in some padding here, or I think actually margins, dock margin. We'll say local ypad equals SER height times 0.01, something like that. So this is the left, this is the top, this is the right, this is the bottom. So we just want it on the top, or actually no. Yeah, maybe on the top. Okay, let's open that up again, and now you can see we have the spacing here, and then I'm going to go ahead and add in some items into my inventory. You'll notice that it doesn't actually refresh yet, so that's something we're going to have to keep in mind, but we're all the way about like right there. Let's open this up again, and boom, now we have our items. So it is working. Next thing we want to do is say scroll.onSizeChanged equals function, and we're just going to say, we're going to loop over all the children. The panels table that we created here, and which stores all these item panels. We're going to loop over those panels basically, and then we're going to say k, which is the panel. We're going to say set tall, and we can do height times, like for example 0.1, so it'll be like 10% of that, and now you can see we have all our items here. What's really great about this now is that we can pull item data. So before I was talking about adding in like a print name, so I'm going to actually do that now, and we'll just say FG42, and then we'll do name equals double barrel shotgun. Okay, so we have all this data which is separated into the items table here, and then if we go ahead and look at our player inventory again, you can see that this is how it's structured. It does not have that data, so we need to basically cross-reference based on this class name to pull data that we've stored and set aside. So to do that, what we can say is we can go ahead and do something like this. We could say local item data equals, and then this is essentially the class name in the table, by the way, the player inventory, because this is the key, this is the value, and this happens to be the class name. So we can do our tut_im.items, we can index by the class name. And now we have all this information here. So if I just go ahead and print table the item data, which is going to print a lot of repeated information, you can now see that we have all this info here that we can index by and decorate this menu with. And so you can get really creative with your items, make them look pretty. You can add in colors and models and all that. So let's go ahead and actually do that now in some way. So I'm going to say item panel.paint equals function. And let's go ahead and override how that looks. So we're just going to go with the transparent black again. Save that. Open that up. Now we got that looking good. Okay, let's add in some actual text. And I need to go ahead and create some fonts. So let me go and get some code for that. Okay, so I have some fonts here. I'm just going to call this inv underscore, for example, 24. And we don't need all this extra information. Just going to get rid of that. Call this 24. And I personally love Roboto. I think it's the nicest one out of the default fonts. And so now I can use that in my code here. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw the item data.name. And we're going to use inv underscore 24 width times 0.05, height times 0.1, and then we'll do color underscore white. Text align left, text align center. Oh, and we need to get rid of that Z. Okay, so now that we have that, let's save that, hop in game. Boom, you can now see that we have the correct names here. I'm just gonna scoot that down just a tiny bit, maybe like that. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Next thing I wanna do is actually give myself another item because I've just been doing the same item over and over again. So I'm gonna go ahead and give myself the FG42. So we do inv underscore give, I think. And then now you can see that we have that. Open up our inventory, scroll down. Now you can see we have the FG42. So that's working out just fine. Beautiful. Okay. Next thing that we could do is add in a model. So I'm going to do that. There's a lot of ways to change the D model positioning. So we're just going to be using a D model panel. So let's get that set up here. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and steal this right here, and we'll use that for our item panel. So we have this icon here. It's not actually being positioned correctly yet. So let's go ahead and do that. And I actually might need to change how I'm using this label here. We might actually need to use a D label, but I'm just going to go ahead and try to position this using docking. So I'm going to say dock left, and then we'll set the size. We actually don't need to do that anymore because we're just docking left. And for the model now, instead of setting it to whatever's here, we can use item data.model. And I'm going to go ahead and save that. And let's make sure that we're adding this to the correct panel. Okay, so this model actually doesn't look too nice. So I'm going to go ahead and get some code to make it look a bit nicer. So let me do that real quick. Okay, so I have some code here. I pulled this from a different add-on of mine. So basically all I added in was this portion here. It just changes the camera positioning, so it looks a bit nicer in the menu. As you can see, it looks correct, and you can see the FG42 is being sized correctly. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this look a bit nicer so we can continue. Okay, so what I want to do is override the paint here. So what I'm going to do is say local old paint equals icon.paint. And so what this is doing is we can reference the old paint function of the icon whenever we are overriding the paint function, which I'll show you here in just a second. So I'm going to do icon.paint equals function with height, and then we're just going to go ahead and call the old paint. That way it still draws the model. So if I go ahead and head in game now, there's not going to be much of a difference. So this is what we're working with here. Then what I want to do here is actually just add in some form of background to this model here. So I'm going to do the same thing, do the nice black, and then just go ahead and draw that. Okay, so we got that there. Next thing we want to do is actually position our text here so it looks correctly. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and scoop this over here. Maybe like that. That will be okay with me. And now that I'm looking at it, this is just a little bit too much in terms of color. So I'm going to maybe dial that down a bit so you can see it a bit better. Okay, so now we have a list of items here. We got our FG42 and our double barrel shotguns. Let's add in a method to actually use these items. So to do that, we're going to need to add in a button on the right. So let me go ahead and do that. Local use button equals, we're going to do item panel self, or not, sorry, add in a D button, use button, and we're going to dock right, use button, set text none, use button dot paint equals function, height, and surface dot set draw color. Okay, so I added in a simple use button here. I'm going to go ahead and add in a drop button as well. So I'm just going to copy and paste this here. Okay, so we have a use and a drop. I know this is not pretty. We're just going for functionality here. So we have our use, our drop, and so now we can call different things with these buttons here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here. I'm going to say use button dot do click equals function, and then drop button, drop button dot do click equals function. Okay, so we have our click methods here. Now what we need to do is add in some form of net messages so the client can communicate to the server indicating what they want to do. So I'm going to add in two entries here. We're going to say env use and env drop. Okay, so we'll start off with use. So we're going to do, whenever they click, we'll say net.start, env use, and then we'll say net.write strings. We're going to write the class name of whatever they're trying to use, which we do have from this loop here. And so we're going to send that to the server so we can let it know that they're trying to use it. And we don't want to send anything else, just the class name. We can get all the data, such as the model and much more from this table here since it is shared. So server side here, what we want to do now is just go ahead and say net.receive that env use, and we're going to get the, I think that's how it goes in terms of arguments, one and the player, and we'll get the class name that they sent by reading the string. And then the first thing we need to do is actually check to see if they have the item. So I'm just going to add in a method here to determine if they have an item, so we can use this in other places if necessary. Env has item, and we'll say class name, and then unfortunately with this sort of setup here, we don't really have a a direct lookup. So we're going to have to loop over the entire table. So this actually might not be the best structure for us in the long term whenever we do create an actual inventory system. Like I said, this is just more of like a rough draft so you can get a general idea of how an inventory system would work. So first thing I'm going to do is going to say found is equal to false. And then we're going to loop over for KVM pairs our inventory, which is self.tut_in. And we're going to say if class name equals v, then end. And actually we can just say return true. Yeah, actually we don't even need this. We can just return true, which will say they have the item. Otherwise, if they complete the entire loop and they don't have the item, we can say return false. Okay, so first thing we want to do is check to see if POI inv has item whenever they call to use this item, pass in that class name. Then we'll go ahead and execute our code here. So what we can do is we can go ahead and store a use on every single item and make it do one specific thing, or we can write out some general use type. So what I'm going to do is on our table here, I'm going to go ahead and write out some rules for the different types of items here. So for example, if it's a weapon, we'll do something, we'll do the weapon use type. If it's an entity, we'll do the entity use type and so on. So we'll say tut_inv.useTypes equals table, and then we say weapon equals this. And we can go ahead and pass in the class name. Or no, let's pass in the item data and the class name. Or sorry, not the item data. Item data and the player. Okay, item data and player. So now what we can do is we can say, so we'll do POI give, and then we'll do item data dot class name. And then we'll say return true. Okay, and so this will basically say, all right, so if this is true, we remove the item from the inventory. If this is false, we keep it. And I'll show you how that works in just a sec. This is not implemented yet, but we will add that in. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this table here, copy that, head over to our server side here, and we're going to say tut use types, and then let's go ahead and get the item data here. Local item data inv.items, that class name. And then we'll index by the item data.type. And then we actually don't need to index anymore. And we can just call that function, and we can pass in the item data and the player. And then we'll say local should remove. So that's that return value that we're going to get. We're going to say if should remove, then end. And let's go ahead and remove that item. Now that I think about it, we don't actually need to use the class name for determining which item we want to remove. We can just send the ID. So I'm actually going to reformat this real quick, and I'll explain it once I'm done. Okay, so instead of sending the class name, I'm going to go ahead and write a number here, and we'll just say K, which is going to be like another form of item ID. So for example, on the client will have 1, 2, 3, 4 items, and they'll want to remove the third item or use the third item. So it'll send the number 3, and then it'll send it to the server. It'll see which item that is, and then it will check to see if they have an actual number 3. And if they do, they'll go ahead and use it. The only thing with this though, we have to make sure that the numbers are in sync, because if at any moment these do become out of sync, if you send, for example, like a 3, but the server doesn't have a 3, your whole inventory system is going to be screwed. But we're just going to go back to numbers instead of class names, because this is just for optimization purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and write the number that they're trying to use. And then we'll also read the same amount of bits on this side here. And so now we have this ID. And then let's go ahead, instead of doing a class name, let's go ahead and do ID instead. So let me just go ahead and do that. Okay. So if they have the item, we're going to loop over this, and instead of actually doing a loop, now we can just say, just to optimize this, we can say if we're going to return self, the player, tut_inv ID. And then so if this returns nil, meaning they don't have an item, if we ever use this in a condition, the condition will not continue, because nil will stop a condition. So now we're going to say if imp has item, and then we can pass in the ID here. Then what we can do is we can go ahead and now get the item data instead of from this class name, which no longer exists. We can do POI.tut_inv, and then we can pass in the ID here. And so that's going to basically return the class name. So this does a lookup for the class name. And then once we have that class name, it indexes this whole thing by here by that class name. Then what we do here is this should remove here is it's going to now look up our use types based on the item data, which is this information here. Oh, that I just closed. This information here, this is all your item data, and we can get that type. And so it's going to index by that type. So if it's a weapon, for example, then, well, what it's going to do is it's going to get here, and then we're going to pass in that item data, which is right there, and the player that's attempting to use it. Then we're going to go ahead and on this player, we're going to give them the class name, and then we're just going to return true, meaning it should be removed from the inventory. So if it should be removed, then what we can do here is we can just say py.tut_env, or actually, you know what? We're going to make a method for this. That way we can easily handle networking. So I'm going to say function _p env remove item, and we'll pass in an ID, and then we'll say self.tut env ID equals nil, and then we need to add in another form of networking. So env remove. So we'll go ahead and use that now. So we'll do net.start env remove net.write int, and we'll say ID, so it's like 32. And the reason why I'm doing 32 is because you don't know really how many items they're going to have. So I'm just doing 32, which is the maximum. And then we'll do send. We're going to send that to self. Okay. So now over here, if we should remove the item, then we're going to say py env remove item, and then that ID that they're trying to remove. Then on our client here, we're going to get that ID, and we're going to basically just do the same thing we did on the server, but on the client. I'm just going to keep this separate up here. We can also add in a method to remove by class name, but it's not as precise. Net.read. The reason why I say that is because, for example, if you have multiple shotguns and you try to remove like an item, like let's say you click on 4 and you have 3 and 4 are shotguns, it might remove 4 from your inventory, or sorry, it might remove 3 from your inventory even though you clicked on 4 because they have the same class name. So we'll do local player .tut_env. And then we'll index by that ID and set that to nil. So what I'm going to do now is just go ahead and strip my weapons. Okay, so I stripped my weapons. And you can see I have none over here. And what I'm going to do is open up that inventory and call use. So I only have 2 FG42, so I think that might be the best option to show. Okay, so now you can see I have this FG42 and it's still in here. We need to refresh this UI, for example, but I'm just going to go ahead and reopen it now. And you can see I only now have 1 FG42. And so it did in fact work. So also one thing that we should do is whenever we give an item, we need to check to see if, like for example, if they already have the weapon out, there's no point in removing that item from their inventory. So what I'm going to do is say if POI has weapon, then I'm just going to return false, meaning the item should not be removed and it's not going to call give. So now if I go into my inventory here and I broke something, attempt to call field open a nil value. The reason why that happened is because I saved this service, this shared file, and it actually overwrote the tutorial inventory. And so to be mindful of refresh, I basically just need to say tut_env equals tut_env or the table here. And then I just need to resave this. So it's going to re-add in the open method here. So let's do that again. And so what I want to do now is basically click use on this. And the point that I'm going for here is that the item is not going to be removed and nothing is going to happen. So I clicked use and the item is still in there. So we know for a fact that our return methods here. So if this is false, then it's not going to actually return the, remove the item. And so this is really helpful. Next thing we want to do is perhaps add in support for a player model. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And actually, I just noticed that we have a bad argument here, has weapon string expected got no value. So the code actually broke. And it's because I didn't actually check to see what class name they were running. So just to double check that that still works, even without the script error, let's go ahead and click use and reopen that. We are good. So it still works and we have no error this time. Okay, so I have SV cheats enabled now. So what I can do is hop into third person. Okay, so you can see I'm in third person. Now what I want to do is set up a method of changing the player model. So I'm going to go ahead and get some models. Okay, so I got 2 player models here that I want to add in. So let's get started on that. I'm just going to go ahead and speed run this real quick. Okay, so I added in these two models here. The only thing that is different about these versus the weapon is now that we have a new type here called model. And for our class name, this is just something I made up personally. These class names are the same as the weapons. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you are giving the weapons. Make sure that the class name is correct. For the player models, they don't really have a class name. They just have a path. So I just made something kind of unique for each one. Otherwise, if you have two models with the same class name, they will clash. So you want to make sure that every class name is unique. So now that we have these, what we want to do is add in a method for using these models. So what we're going to do here is going to add in another use type. We're going to say the same information here. And what we want to do is just say, we don't want to remove these items. Actually, I would consider these permanent. There's no reason to have these removed because all we want to do is just switch the model. So I'm just going to say POI set model, and we'll do item data dot model. And then we can just return false, meaning we don't want that item to be removed. Okay, so now that we got that, I want to go ahead and actually give these to myself. So I'm going to hop in game now. I'm going to give myself the model classic zombie. You can see I successfully picked up the item, and then we're going to do the same thing for our gas mask. Okay, so if we open this up now, you can see down here, we now have these models here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this one, and you can see, wow, it changed my model. It worked. This works, and we're all good. That's actually working, and we know that is right. Sick. Okay, so now that we got some form of using here, what I want to do is actually add in support for entities. So this one's going to be a little bit complicated because there's sometimes metadata which is associated with entities, and with this setup we can't actually add support for those, which is going to be unfortunate. So for example, in my weapon shelf add-on, if you have weapons on the shelf, let's say like 3 weapons, and you were to pick up the shelf and while it had 3 weapons and drop it, those 3 weapons would not be there or stored because we have no metadata associated with these items. We're just storing the class name. And so this is another downside to this sort of inventory structure, but it will work for much more simple cases. So to get that set up, I'm just going to go ahead and add in my weapon shelf real quick and get that going. You can use any entity you want. I'm just using my weapon shelf. Also, I notice I am going to need a method for getting the model of whatever I'm looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and actually add in another method here, or another command. So this is what I just did here is just I get the iTrace of the player and we check to see if there's an entity. If there's not a valid entity, then we return n, and then we're just going to print ent, and then we'll call get model on it. So if I do inv underscore, we'll say tr model, inv underscore tr underscore model, you can see that it returns the model of whatever I'm looking at. So that's just a bit easy, or makes configuring a bit easier. Okay, so now that we have this, I'm just going to change our type to entity. And so this is probably going to be the most complex portion. What we need to do is make it so the entity spawns in front of us. So if it's an entity, this is what we'll do. So we're going to create the item data.class name, which is going to be associated with the entity. And then we're going to set the position to the POI. Let's see, IPOS. I think we can do forward times 1.5 maybe. I'm not sure if this is the correct method. Ent set angles. We'll just set it to 0 and then we'll call spawn. Okay, and we'll say return true no matter what. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and give myself a weapon shelf. So let's see if this works. Okay, I have the weapon shelf in my inventory. I'm going to go ahead and click use, and we got an error. Attempt to call method forward a nil value. So let me see what the correct method is, because I actually have this written down somewhere. Okay, so I got some code here. Basically, it just takes the eye position and it gets the forward of their eye angles, and it just kind of puts it in front of them. So what I'm going to do is now use this for our position here. It kind of is the same thing that I was going for, but not correct because the eye position doesn't have forward. We needed the angles. So I'm going to just do trace.hitPos, which is going to get the position in front of the player. And let's go ahead and try that now. Self seems to be a nil value because I definitely did not account for player. So let's fix that. There we go. Okay, so now you can see that we have our shelf being spawned in here. And I think if I go back into my inventory, it is now gone. Okay, so entity spawning is working, player model using is working, and our weapons are working. So now the next portion of this is to actually make the inventory refresh. So I'm going to do that. Okay, so one simple method of doing this is to basically just send a net message to the client whenever the item is successfully used and just kind of rebuild the menu. We could go ahead and remove the item that was used from the menu that's currently open. But just to keep things simple, we're just going to go ahead and refresh things. So now that I'm looking at this, what we're going to want to do is refresh this whenever we remove an item, and then maybe whenever we give an item. So I'm going to go ahead and write a method now that basically just refreshes the inventory. So now that we have this method, we're just going to call this whenever we remove an item. And then we're going to call this whenever we give an item. So on our client side here, now we're going to go ahead and receive this net message and go ahead and recall the open. Okay, and so whenever we open this, this is just going to repopulate the menu, but what we need to do here is just add in a check to see if the menu is already open. So if it's valid, then what we're going to do is remove it. Okay, so now hopefully this will work out the way that we want it to. So I'm just going to go ahead and give myself another shelf here. And you can notice that the menu actually opened on its own, and that's not what I want. I just realized I was not thinking logically. So first we need to actually check to see if this is open. So if it's open, then we're just going to basically reopen it. Otherwise, we don't do anything. So now I can give myself shelves without an issue. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down to our weapon shelves. You can see we have 3. I'm going to click use. And scroll down, it reopened for us automatically, and now we only have 2. And so that is working pretty well, I would say. Looks good, looks good. Okay, so now the next portion is we need to add in dropping, and I think we will be good for this first portion. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add in dropping now. So I'm going to scroll down to our drop button here in our client side file. I'm going to go ahead and just call this net message here, and we're going to write the number again, and we're going to send it to the server. Okay, so on the server here, whenever we receive this, we're going to go ahead and basically create that base item. So for example, if we were to if we just dropped like the shelf in our inventory, it would drop the scripted shelf, and if you press E on it, it's not going to go into your inventory. So we created this base item here, which will, whenever you press E on it, it'll take the data that's associated with it. So like if it's like, for example, a shelf, it'll store that shelf in your inventory and remove it. And I'll show you that now. Okay, so we're just going to check to see if they have the item, and then we'll continue if they do. We can actually just go ahead and copy and paste what's above here. It's pretty much the same thing. So we just need to get that item data now. Okay, so what I can go ahead and do now is create our inventory item entity. So I'm going to say local item int.create. Item. And I'm going to steal the positioning that we had for our entity spawning. Okay, so now that we have this set up here, what we're going to do is just go ahead and test it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and drop this weapon shelf now, and instead of dropping a shelf, or it should just drop the cube, as you can see here. And so that's working. I'm actually going to go back into first person now, so we can see that the cube is there. And that's about it. There's nothing really associated with it. So what we need to do now is add in some methods to basically decorate this entity. So we're going to do function int set item, and then we're going to pass in item data. Then what we're going to do is we'll say self.className equals item data.className. So we're going to override or store a value on this base item of whatever the class name is of the item that we're setting it to. And so if you go here, before we spawn it, we can just do item int set, I believe it was just item. Is that what I called it? Yeah, set item. We're going to set the item to the item data that we get. Okay. So, but that item data is going to return all of this information here. We can get the class name. And so we're just going to store that. And then what we can also do is we can say self set model, and we can get the item data dot model. Then on here, whenever we do function int use, think it's activator caller. Inside our use here, we can say if self.className. So if it is a valid item, then we'll go ahead and take one of our functions here, such as env_give, and we can go on the caller and we can say env_give, and we'll do self.className, and then we can just remove this item. And so now, right now we don't actually remove the item whenever it's dropped, so items are going to be duplicated just for the moment here. But if I go ahead and drop this shelf here, and then I press E on it, you can see it says successfully picked up item weapon shelf, and for some reason the model did not change. Oh, the reason why that didn't change is because we're calling set item before we spawn it. To fix that, we need to call set item after we spawn it, and that should do it. So let's try that one more time. Drop. You see we got a shelf there. It looks like a shelf. However, this is not actually the weapon shelf. It's just a base item here. And so you can see successfully picked up item weapon shelf. However, if we go to use a shelf, this is actually a real shelf. I'm pressing E on it, nothing's happening. And so it's basically just mimicking it so we can pick up that item. And that works pretty good. Okay, next portion, what we need to do is remove it. So what we can do now is we can say self env remove item, and we can remove that ID of the item that we're attempting to drop. So let's say I drop one of these double barrels. You can see we got one on the ground right there. I'm just going to go ahead and just drop a bunch of these actually, because we have a lot. And I don't know if this is actually refreshing or not. It's not for some reason. Okay, one sec. Let's check in on that. Oh, I realized we're calling self again, POI. Okay, one more time though. Drop, drop. And you can see it is in fact working, and there's just a bunch of shotguns everywhere. And so we know that the items are now dropping and it is working. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Last and final portion of this, just so we know that this is an item and it's a little bit different than whatever's being dropped on the ground as like an actual weapon, we're going to go ahead and add in some 3D, 2D overhead to it. So let's do that. Okay, so I just pasted a bunch of gibberish here. This is some code from my Xanax system that I made on Gmod Store. I'm just going to change up a few things here, and I'm just going to break this down for you because there's a lot of information here that doesn't really need to be explained, but I'll go ahead and just try to break it down in the simplest way I can. So this right here is just some positioning for the angles for our 3D 2D, or sorry, not our 3D, yes, for our 3D 2D for our positioning here. Then we have our angles here for cam.start 3D 2D, which is basically just changing the angles of the actual text itself or whatever we're drawing. And so this code right here that I have highlighted just makes it so it will constantly face our local player. Then this portion here is just our scale. You want to try to keep that as high as you can, because the lower that number is, I believe how it requires a much more processing power from your GPU to draw, I think. Don't quote me on that. And then right here on this portion, we just are using math.sine, and we're creating a number which will just basically go up and down, and we can use this for our Y position here on any of our text. First thing here that we need to change is the font here, because we're not using DZANs anymore. We're using our inventory. And also right here for our text, what I'm going to do is actually just use the item name that we have stored in our items table. So to do that, what we need to do first is just make sure that this actually has a class name. And if you look here, our class name gets called whenever we call set item, but there is one problem with this. This is only called the server. So we're going to actually have to add in some networking to make this class name get networked to the client, so the client is aware of this class name, because if right now the class name does not exist at all. Then additionally, what we need to do is get the item data. So assuming that we do have that class name whenever we add support for it, we're going to do tut_env items, and we'll do self.className. And so we can return the item data similar to how we've been doing it in our inventory menu, but in this case for our base item draw method. And then for our text here, which is going to be our title, I'm just going to go ahead and say item data.name. Okay, so then what we have here is we're setting our draw color to something dark. We're setting our font to inventory 24. We have our text here, and then we're basically just calculating the text width and text height by using the surface.getTextSize, which requires us to do set font. Then we're drawing a rectangle based on the text width, and we're just dividing that by 2. So it's basically in the center here, and then we draw our text in the center. So now if I save this and go in game, you won't see anything different here. And so to actually make this work, we're going to add in a network string, util.add network string, and this will be _item set item. And then we're just going to go ahead and network this class name. Net.start this, net.write our string, which is going to be self.class name. And then we're going to net.broadcast this to every player so they are aware. Okay, and then whenever we receive this, net.receive on the client. Also, one problem that I just realized is we're going to actually need to write the entity itself so they know which entity they're referencing. Write entity, and we'll write self. Okay, so we wrote the class name and the entity. So local class name equals net.read string. Local int equals net.read entity. We'll say int.class name equals class name. Okay, so now I believe if I drop an item now, there's a potential for it to show the correct name. So let me go ahead and open up my inventory, and I'm just going to drop this FG42. And does it work? Apparently not. Why not? Self.class name. Let's go ahead and just do some debugging here. I'm going to put prints everywhere. Okay, so after looking at this, it turns out that we are getting a null entity. And so the way around that is to actually request the class name whenever the entity is initialized on the client. So I'm going to go ahead and do that instead. So instead of doing inv_item set item, I'm just going to call this inv item request. And so basically this is just the client requesting data about the item here. And then let's go ahead and on our initialize here, which means that this entity is being created on the client, we're going to do net.start this. We're going to net.write the entity that we're requesting data for, which will be self, and then we're going to send that to the server. Beautiful. Okay, so now that we got that, what we need to do is whenever the server receives this message from the client, we're going to look up that entity and find any data that we have on it and send it back. So we're going to say local int equals net.read entity. And then we're going to say if int.class name, then we're going to say net.start. We're going to start the same request here, and then we're going to write string int.class name. And then we're going to net.write the entity back. And we're going to net.send to the client that requested it to begin with. And just to be safe, we're also just going to check the entity's actual class name. Or we'll say if it's not equal to inv_item, then we're just going to return n, meaning the code below will not execute. Okay. Then back at the client, once they get that response, which is basically like a ping, we have that class name, this, yada, 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 and let's see if it works now. Okay, did not seem to work. Oh, we got an error here. It's not get class name, it's just class name. Or not. Or it's just get class. Sorry, I haven't coded in Gmod in a minute. Okay, we got something going here. Get text size string expected got nil. Okay, we're almost there. So the problem here is this text is not returning the right information here. So why is it not name? Oh, it's lowercase name. I was doing capital N. So to fix that, we just go lowercase, save. And now voila, you can see it's a double barrel shotgun. And so if I go ahead and let's try dropping something else now, like a weapon shelf. You now see it's a weapon shelf. I press E on it. It's picking up, it's dropping. We got it going in our inventory. Okay, so that will conclude this video. Next video, we're going to talk about data saving, making sure that we load that correctly and all of our information is formatted correctly. If there's anything else that I missed in this tutorial, we will cover in the next one. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you guys have any questions, comment them down below. I have a Discord. I hope you guys are in there. Come say hi. If you have any questions, need help whatsoever, I will be there to support you. And so will many other wonderful people. So like I said, hope you guys enjoyed this and take care.